Welcome back to the Bible Journey program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your family. I am your presenter and companion in this journey, Sister Beatrice, and we continue to look at the Holiness Code that you find in chapter 17 to 26 of the third book of the Pentateuch, the book of Leviticus. And now we have already looked at the introduction to this book of the Code of Holiness. We have seen what the Lord is asking the people to be able to live close to Him, to sanctify all that they use or what they are. We have seen the issue of the sanctity of sex. Let's look at chapter 19, and this chapter actually presents to us again what we call the Levitical dialogue and the life of holiness. This means it presents to us again what we call the 10 commandments, and they are called the Decalogue. And these are presented in a slightly different manner as we are used to them, so that they create a kind of an ethical and ritual perspective, perspective. Now, one of the special characteristics of this chapter 19 of the book of Leviticus is the repetition of the expression, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. I always remind you, dear listener, whenever we speak about being created in the image and likeness of God that we found in the book of Genesis, actually what we are dealing with practically is that holiness that comes from God. That holiness that comes from God. That's what we are dealing with. So when you hear the Lord saying, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy, it's actually He's reminding us that He has created us in His own image. So that holiness is again expected of us. And also in this book, you find in this chapter 19 of the Code of Holiness in the book of Leviticus, you find also this expression, "I'm the Lord your God." That attachment of the Lord to His people. And it's really a beautiful, beautiful expression. It's not a threat. You know, some people think when the Lord said, "I'm the Lord your God," He's going to say something so difficult. No, God is not threatening us. He is making possession of us. It's like when our parents say, "This is my son, this is my daughter." It's a very beautiful expression. And it brings a lot of joy and happiness to us when they do so. So let us look, how are the 10 commandments or the Decalogue, because are presented to this. And these actually, we could even call them the priestly 10 commandments. We have said that this holiness code actually comes directly from the priestly tradition. The first one says, "You shall be holy, for the Lord your God, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." The second one says, "You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, or lie to one another." The third one tells us, "You shall not swear my name falsely." The fourth one, "You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him." The fifth one, "You shall do no injustice in judgment." When you're making a judgment, you're not to commit any injustice. Then the sixth one says, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall not take vengeance, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." That is the sixth one. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall not take vengeance, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is chapter 19, verse 17 and 18. You find that similar thing repeated by Jesus, the similar expression in Mark chapter 12, verse 31. Then the seventh one tells us, "You shall keep my statutes," that you shall keep my laws. "You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind, and you shall not eat any flesh with blood on it." The eighth one is, "You shall not practice witchcraft or any other kind of sorcery." Very clear. I think it is speaking to us, especially here in Africa. The ninth one says, "You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary." You shall keep the Sabbath and reverence the sanctuary. And the 10th says, "You shall rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear the Lord." You shall rise up before a white head, somebody who has white hair, as signifying a person who is older than you, You shall honor the face of an old man, and you shall fear God. Those two are put together, honoring an elderly person, respecting an elderly person, and also fearing the Lord. I think these things speak to us. I don't even need to explain so much. And the most noteworthy saying in this chapter 19 that I would want you to remain with as a listener, my dear listener, is what you find in chapter 19, verse 18, the second part of that sentence, 18b, and also you find it again repeated in verse 34 of the same chapter 19. And it says, you shall not hate any of your kindred in your heart. Reprove your neighbor openly so that you do not incur sin because of that person. Take no revenge and cherish no grudge against your own people. Now the golden rule comes. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. This is in the Old Testament. Jesus has not even come. Already this information has been given to us. And I think the book of Leviticus actually sends us to do a very, very elaborate, deep examination of conscience. Chapter 21 deals with what we call, chapter 20 deals with some punishments. That's why we are skipping it. Chapter 21 speaks about priestly holiness. And this one deals with the office of the priest. And this office is considered in the book of Leviticus and for the Israelites as a holy office, and actually is an office that is given to man, but is above the man. So there's no way us as human beings can defile the office of the priesthood. Therefore, a priest must be holy in body. The priest must be upright in conduct. The priest has to be clean ritually, as he is a representative of God. The priest must be holy in body. The priest must be upright in conduct and clean ritually, as he is representing God. And the Old Testament priests were actually called upon, to be more holy and more perfect than ordinary people. So whatever was asked of the ordinary people, the priest was supposed to take it a notch higher. And I think we understand that. I don't need to make a lot of explanation. And this chapter 21 deals with this section of holiness of the priests and prohibits a few things. For example, the priest is prohibited from touching a dead body because it has no life in it. It is corruptible, and that it was not something that the priest could touch. Then the priest was not allowed to disfigure himself. He couldn't put tattoos on his body, for example. There were other disfigurements that people could put in their body, either for beauty or for other reasons. The priest is not allowed to do that. The priest was not allowed to marry prostitutes, harlots, was not allowed to marry somebody who has been defiled, was not allowed to marry divorced women. Then also, he was not allowed to participate in mourning and going near dead bodies. So when people were mourning, there was a very elaborate mourning, a way of mourning among the Israelites, whereby people would let loose their hair, that they used to cover it and all that, the way when you are devastated, in agony and anguish, somebody has died. There were those things. So the priest is not allowed to join in that show of excessive emotion in mourning. He was also not allowed to go near dead bodies, and he was not allowed to marry any woman except women who were virgins. That was also a value for every other man, but for the priest, he was not allowed to do that. Maybe another man would marry a widow, which a priest could not do because she's already touched by somebody else. That was in reference to keep himself clean. And priests with blemishes, because priesthood at that time it was hereditary. If my father was a priest, then if I am a male child, I could become a priest. But maybe unfortunately, I may be born handicapped in one way or with some kind of blemish or some kind of weakness. Actually, those were not allowed to approach the altar. And actually, priests were also warned. Their families were supposed to live a certain kind of way. So they were not allowed, they were to keep their daughters very well, that they don't enter into prostitution. And of course, if they had disabled, lame, blind, dumb, dwarf, or descendants, or those who became lepers, because it could happen, they were not allowed to officiate as priests. And the priests lived extremely severe lives, and their main concern was to remain holy and ritually clean at all times. And it was really impossible to engage in many of the other everyday activities because the priest was not to be incapacitated to offer sacrifice for the people. He was to be there all the time, but there were these requirements that he had to be ritually clean and all that. So that would create all these other difficulties for him. But the point is not just what he was to do or not to do, but the deep respect that this office was given because it dealt directly with what the people were doing in connection to worshiping and experiencing God. So that's why it was very, very important. Then, of course, we have the issue of the holy things that we find in chapter 22. And this one deals with gifts and sacrifices contributed by the people and considered as holy. And the priests were not allowed to minister if they were unclean. Unclean could mean, for example, an animal with blemishes. If the prescription for that sacrifice is that the animal should have only one color, then the animal should have only one color. So if it came with several colors, it was a duty of the priest to examine it and to make sure that nothing that was not clean was administered. You know, there were holy things. Of course, there were also what was offered to be eaten by the priests and their family. And there were also rules how this could be done that we find in this chapter 23, whereby, for example, the family of the priest could partake in most of the holy things that the priests were given at the altar as offering. But outsiders, and when we talk about outsiders, we're talking about if a visitor came, he would be given as another meal. He couldn't be given those which were offered for sacrifice. Hired servants could not partake of the food of the priest, even though the priest had hired him maybe to do some work in his farm. A daughter who had already been married outside and married to a non-priest husband. He was married to any other person who was not a priest. From the moment she got married outside her family, she was not allowed to partake of that. A widow also was not allowed to partake of that. A divorced daughter also, if the daughter became a widow or became divorced, she could not take that. And but it is interesting to note, if the priest had a slave, not a hired servant, but bought a slave, the slave could partake of that. And animals, as I said, with blemishes or from foreigners, actually, if they were not from the Jews, were not allowed to be offered at the sanctuary. Then let's look at the holy times. The same holiness code talks about holy times. There were moments which were actually quite holy, which we find in chapter 23. And this is actually very, very interesting. And these were holy times, and the Israelites refer to them as feasts that were instituted by God through Moses. And the main feasts mentioned in this chapter are, first of all, the Sabbath. Of course, some people will tell you the Sabbath is not actually a feast, but it was actually a day that was set apart, and it was actually a feast because you would rest without doing any work. Then you have the Passover, or unleavened bread. We have also spoken about that, but I shall give a brief overview. You have also the first sheaf. This is a feast that is not clear what it really was and how it was carried out. Then you have the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. And then you have the New Year. You have the Day of Atonement. You have the Feast of Tabernacles, or Booths, or Tents. And these Jewish holy times, we can see, were divided into two. One, there are those which are found in the Torah and those which were added later. And the feasts that we find in the Torah, now we know what is the Torah. The Torah are the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the first 5 books, as we know that those are the Torah, and they are important to the Israelites because that is the law given to Yahweh, given to Moses by Yahweh. So the ones which we find in the Torah are, first of all, the Sabbath, then the 3 pilgrim feasts, that is the Feast of Tabernacles, or shelters, or booths, or tents. Then we have the Passover, and then the Feast of Weeks, and of course, we have the New Year, or the first day of the lunar month. Then we have others that I shall actually mention because it's important for us, because when we come in the New Testament, we find those mentioned. And we see maybe Jesus went to Jerusalem because it was the Feast of Tabernacles, it was the Feast of Weeks. Especially when you look at the book, the Gospel of John, you'll find those. So we shall take a break and we shall come and have a short overview of these holy moments that were considered holy in the book of of Leviticus, and actually is still, most of them are still considered holy by the people of Israel, by the people of Israel. So let's take a break as we continue to look at the holiness code in the book of Leviticus, that is chapter 17 to 26.